Hello. This is Nelson Olmsted. The National Broadcasting Company presents Story for Tonight. Mankind has always enjoyed a good story. It was that way in the beginning when our ancestors gathered around campfires to hear accounts of adventures. Today we can enjoy the finest tales ever written, the result of thousands of years of experience. And we don't gather around the campfire, but around the radio. This is a program designed to bring to life for you the most compelling and dramatic modern short stories that have been written. Here is your teller of tales, Nelson Olmsted.
Thank you, Hugh Downs. It was James Stephens who once said, "Women are wiser than men because they know less and understand more." That's the way it is in our story for tonight. It's about a man who went mad and of a woman's fight for his life.
Well, that sounds interesting, Nelson. Who wrote it?
One of my favorite authors, Hugh, James Francis Dwyer. He's written some of the finest adventure stories that have been published in America, and this is one of the best of them. It takes place in the Far East, where the breath of the jungle can sometimes obliterate our so-called modern civilization. It's entitled The Soul Trapper. John Hockdorf, the greatest naturalist in the Malay archipelago, who knew more of the ways of animals than any of the 70 collectors employed by the big Amsterdam firm, spoke soothingly to a black monkey that whined in the shadow. The tropical night had rolled down from Asia, and a tremendous silence had come in its train. A new moon rode high over the tops of the jungle, where sandalwood and teak, in league-wide masses, resembled an ebony base upon which the dome of the heavens was softly resting. We'd been talking about the fact that we'd never seen a white woman in this country, and Hockdorf was off on a story. He said, "But a white woman did come to this spot once. You know, there's no place on earth where a man goes that a woman will not follow if the necessity arises, and for that I thank God. This Samarahan River is as near hell as you can go, yet a woman came here. She wasn't a collector of monkeys or bugs or anything like that. This woman came to, well, she came to trap a man's soul. I'll tell you first about the man. We'll call him Hanslaw. That's as good a name as any. And he came from Baltimore. He had the bungalow on the other side of the river, the one just below the Dyak village that I showed you this morning. And after he was here some time, we became great friends. He was a fine naturalist, none better. He loved his work. And he wouldn't stop from dawn till midnight. Hanslaw, I would say, you're a fool to work like that. You're just what all young Americans are, just a bundle of nerves. And if you go pounding along like that, something will stop all of a sudden in your head, and you'll go up like a rocket on the 4th of July. Well, I've got to make good, Hockdorf, he'd say. I've got to make good, and make good quick. Work is nothing if you have the right incentive, and by all that's holy, I have that incentive. That was all he'd say, just that. Work was nothing to him. Just because there was a woman over there in the United States 6,000 miles from this little hell in Borneo, he could not feel tired. It was wonderful. Through the smoke from that stinking slush lamp, he saw her eyes looking at him from way over in Baltimore, and he wouldn't stop. In the night sometimes, I would get out of bed and look across the river, and no matter when I looked, his light would still be burning. Then One day he was working on a skeleton of a big orangutan, and he laid down his knife quietly, very, very quietly, and he went out and started to play with little pebbles on the bank of the river. It chilled my blood. "Henslow," I said, "what's the matter? Get up and leave those pebbles alone." But he wouldn't get up. He sat there on his haunches and played like a 3-year-old baby. Henslow had blown up, poof, just like that. Well, for 8 days he loafed around the bungalow doing no work and talking little, and in those 8 days something happened that was peculiar. The veneer of the centuries peeled off him like the skin of a snake, and Henslow, the greatest naturalist that has ever come to this infernal archipelago, became a savage. It was what you might call a backward migration of the soul, or perhaps the soul left him altogether. His brain was like a bit of new clay, and it picked up impressions from the Dayak natives, like a dry sponge sucks up water. He flung off his clothes, tied a chawat of bark cloth around his waist, and did things native fashion, and it hurt me to see that. He broke up specimen cases to make fish traps, and he didn't know they were specimen cases when he broke them up. Yet he'd lectured me about Humboldt a few nights before. On the 8th day, Breckman, a friend of mine, came 17 miles up the river because I'd sent a message to him telling him what had happened, and we held a consultation about Henslow. He was fishing with the Dayaks in the river while we talked, and he fished better than any of them, and that's saying a lot. But the wonder was that he'd never spent any time fishing till that flywheel went wrong in his brain. Do you see? In 8 days, he'd learned all the tricks that the natives knew about fishing, and he'd brought 50 new tricks from out of the back of his brain, where some ancestor of his, dead 1,000 years or so, had stored them. I knew that he'd never seen a dozen crocodiles since he came to Borneo. And I know that he'd never attempted to catch one of those ugly devils in his life before that day he started to play with pebbles. Yet he could beat all those natives at the business after a few days. He tackled crocodiles with as much composure as I'd tackle a glass of beer. "We should take him down the coast," said Breckman. "It's bad to let him run wild with the natives." "Yes," I said. "If we could get him on the tramp steamer and get him down to Singapore, his consul might look after him." "Will we start now?" "No. We'll leave it till morning. We'll invite him on a trip down to your place, and if he gets suspicious, we must kidnap him." Now, I know that Henslow didn't hear what Breckman and I'd planned to do. We took good care to be out of hearing. But instinct is better than hearing. Henslow had his instinct sharpened when that flywheel went wrong. You bet he had. And he felt that Breckman and I were scheming something that concerned him. In the morning, when we were making preparations to go down the river, he bolted. Yes, he bolted into the jungle. I told you he'd become a better savage than the natives. Well, he was. We went in pursuit of him with a crowd of Dayaks, and he made fools of us. We were tenderfeet compared to him and his knowledge of the jungle. Good Lord, yes. He fooled us like we were so many children. He chattered like an animal. I tried every way to get the madman back to the bungalow, but it was no good. 3 weeks after he'd bolted, a mail came up from the coast. There was a letter for Henslow from Baltimore, and I opened it. It was beautiful. It made me feel sorry to think that I had no one to write me letters like that. I think that I could have worked as Henslow worked if I had. Henslow said that love was the big lever that moved the world. I believe him now. The day before his brain snapped, he quoted some lines of verse to me, and I didn't understand them until I read that letter. Yes, I remember those lines. Methinks no leaf would ever bud in spring, but for the lover's lips that kiss, the poet's lips that sing. You think it strange that I, an old bachelor who's trapping animals in this wilderness, should remember those lines. Wait till I tell you all the story and you'll not think it's strange. You'll understand why I remember. I read that letter 8, 12, 20 times, and then I sat down and wrote an answer to it. I tried my best to write that girl a good letter. I told her all that I knew. I told her how he'd worked through the days and through the tropical nights when the hot smells get up off the ground and take you with their cursed fingers till you drip with perspiration. And I told her how the little belt had slipped from the flywheel in his brain. It was no good trying to lie to the woman who wrote that letter, not one bit. My, I never did such a bit of writing in all my life. When I'd finished it, I sent it down to the coast with 2 of the Dyaks. And then I went about my work. If Henslaw was crazy, I couldn't give his craziness as an excuse to my employers. As time went on, that madman tried to make me as much of a lunatic as the fates had made himself. He would come down here by the river at night and howl at me. That was pleasant, wasn't it? He would howl at me from the trees, and then he would sneak softly up to the windows of the bungalow and send rocks flying among my specimens. It was a devil. Breckman came up the river, and he grinned when I told him of the tricks that Henslaw was up to. It amused him because he was 17 miles away. Shoot a charge of salt at him, he said. Shoot at his bare legs, and I bet he knows enough to keep away from your place. Now, you go back where you came from, I screamed. It's not your specimens that he's playing the mischievous with. Clear out and leave me to mind my own business. And he did clear out, wondering whether I'd snap something in the back of my head like Henslaw. Oh, Henslaw kept me mighty busy in the nights that followed. One would think that the mad devil had 100 arms to judge by the way he sent stones down on this place. He made my life a misery. I couldn't open a window to get a breath of air. And if I sat in the dark with the door open, he seemed to know. He had cat's eyes. He ruined much of my best work. But when I would be that angry that I could kill him, I would think of that girl's letter. It went on like that for 3 months. One morning, while I was skinning a crocodile down on the bank of the river, I saw a boat coming up the stream. There were 4 Dyaks pulling it, and someone else was sitting in the stern. I stood up and watched it, and something came up in my throat that was bigger than the dome on St. Peter's in Rome. Oh, Lord. I took a new view of the world in that minute. Just before I saw the boat, everything looked bad and crooked. Then everything changed. Henslaw told the truth. The flowers wouldn't bud in the spring if it wasn't for love. I, an old bachelor who's not heard a good woman laugh for 15 years, I tell you that. And it's the truth. I think I helped her out of the boat when it grounded on the stinking mud. Yet I'm doubtful to this day if I did. I have an idea sometimes that I stood there like a badly stuffed specimen. Can you think what a task that woman set herself in coming from Baltimore to this hell? Can you imagine it? It made the sweat run down from my face when I thought of what she'd put up with in coming up the river with 4 dirty, naked natives. There are no Cook excursions around Borneo, my friend. The girl didn't talk much. She merely said, "You are Mr. Hoxdorf," as if we'd met on the corner of a busy street. And then she thanked me for my letter. You would think that I was expecting her, and that it wasn't 6,000 miles of a run between the United States and Borneo. I cried. I cried to think that the world is not as bad as some bilious devils make out. Out on this God-forgotten place, I was witnessing something that poets could sing of. Yes, it was good to think that there were women like her in the world. He didn't ask any questions, and that's the wonder of it. She just looked at me and at the cursed jungle that was crushing in all around the bungalow. You know, she never mentioned Hansel all that day. She just sat by the little window and stared at the trees. Once only she looked up at me, and I said, sometime before midnight, before I could stop myself. And she nodded when I said it. She didn't eat anything much, and I knew she was praying for the night. That madman was somewhere up in the hills sleeping, and I knew that he'd be down to give my bungalow a bombardment when the night came down thick. But when the darkness fell like a blanket, she stood up and walked to the door. She promised me she would go only as far as the clearing and no farther. Then she quietly went out into the dark. The moon wasn't up, and the night was so thick you would think it possible to cut up the darkness into cubes and build things out of it. A tropical night has a breed of blackness that you'll not find anywhere else. It made me nervous to let her go, but I knew it was no use trying to stop her, and I knew she wanted to go by herself. She'd come 6,000 miles to do something, and I was nothing in the scheme of things, nothing at all. About an hour after the girl went out, I called to her, and she answered to me from the big tape-hang tree in the clearing. She said she was all right, and I wasn't to worry about her. But I couldn't keep from worrying. I strained that thick night for noises till my ears ached, and every time a twig cracked in the jungle, I was at the door with my neck poked forward like a water snake. It was a night when you would expect things to happen. And that graveyard silence made me perspire, I'll tell you. I was just going to call out again to the girl when that thick night air was set quivering. It was like as if little threads of purple and silver and gold were being threaded in and out of the dark patches, and I gasped. She was singing. She was singing out there in the night, and I'd never heard such singing. I forgot that I was in Borneo when I heard it. It just crushed out the darkness and the loneliness of this inferno and lifted me up and took me 10,000 miles away. Mother of me, it had that soft croon in it that a mother breathes to a sick baby. And you can't hear that every day. I moved out of the doorway and listened. Her voice was as sweet as the silver tulip bell at the Dilwara temple. It swirled around and around like silk lariats, and you couldn't tell whether she was in the clearing or across the river. It was wonderful. She stopped for a second, as if she wished to listen. And before the notes of her song had died away, a stone crashed against the window of the bungalow, and a hyena scream went up into the night like a brass blare. I was never more sick in my life than at that moment. It was terrible. I had to sit down on the steps because I had no strength to stand. I was sick with the thoughts of what she was suffering. The girl started to sing again, and there was no more laughing, and there were no more stones. She sang and sang, and the jungle listened. Lord, it was weird. Somewhere in the trees was a man whose soul had gone out of his body, and she was trying to bring it back. Perhaps you can't see how big it was to me on that night, but I tell you that I'd never heard anything like it. I'm not the most emotional of men, but I've never had such strange sensations in my life. Her singing went into the very marrow of my being. It made me feel as if I'd come up against something that the world had overlooked in its haste to make dollars. I don't know what it was. I can't explain it to you. But it was a soul calling to a soul. Ah, yes. I stayed awake all through the night. There were no more stones and no more laughter. Toward dawn, when the first bit of baby pink came up out of Micronesia, I shook myself and stumbled down through the clearing. She was standing near the tapang tree, where she'd been 8 hours before, and I took her by the arm and led her inside the bungalow. Her dress was all wet with the dew, and her face was as white as the snow on the Himalayas, but she never spoke. Not one word about the night, not a single word. next night, he threw stones. But it didn't seem to give him the devilish amusement that he got out of the business before she started to sing. He did his little cannonade, and then he crept away or listened to her in the trees. But the fact that he was somewhere near and yet not visible to her was making that girl suffer. I saw that. She was being crucified by the black jungle that held him from her. And there was nothing for me to do. Once I hinted at some scouting work, but I dropped that hint in a hurry. It was not on her program. All I could do was sit and wait and try and coax her to eat something that would keep her strength up. Night after night, she sang in different places around the bungalow. And those big trees seemed to listen to her like so many giants. And then, after about 2 weeks of that, Hanslaw stopped throwing stones. But he was there in the dark. She knew that. And I read the information in her face. I could see it, and I could hear it in her voice. And then one night, it was a fine moonlight night, the miracle happened. The Samarahan River looked like a belt of silver, and the snags stood up like black spikes that were holding it down in its bed. The girl was down near the bank. Presently, she started to sing in a way that I'd never heard before. It was more wonderful than I'd ever heard her sing. And in that moonlight, it had a witchery in it that was astounding. It was a magic melody. I crept down through the bushes till I could see her. She was standing right on the bank of the stream, and she was looking across the river to that strip of sand that you can see directly in front of the little landing. I followed the direction of her eyes, and then I saw. Yes, I saw it was Hanslaw. I'd never seen him fully since the day he ran away. He was standing on the strip of bare sand, and he was looking straight across at her. He stood like a statue. His limbs were bare, and the only thing that he had on was the bark cloth chawat that he'd put on when he threw away his clothes. I laid down flat on my stomach and waited. There seemed to be nothing in the world but those two people. It was just a big, empty globe in which a girl fought for the soul of a man against a jungle. That was how it seemed to me. It's only in a place like this that you could see a drama like that. There was a silver stream in which the dirty, scaly-backed crocodiles were sleeping, the madman on the other side, and the girl. And I was the only spectator of a play that was bigger than anything Shakespeare ever conceived. Hanslaw was looking at her. She was right down on the bank, and the big moon lit up the place like a festival night. For 5 minutes, he stood motionless. And all that time, she sang in a way that would tear the heart out of an image. She was singing for her own life as well as for his. I knew that. Her voice never had such melody in it as it had at that minute, and it will never have it again. Her singing seemed to hold him, but the moment she stopped exhausted, he made a quick move for the shadows. He crossed the sand when something happened. I don't know if she threw herself into the water or if the rotten bank gave way beneath her when she was leaning out. I think it was the latter. But before I could get on my feet, she was being swept down the river. You know what the Samarahan River is. It's alive with crocodiles. I got to my feet with that most awful feeling, and as I did so, a cry like the cry of a lost soul came from Hanslaw, and his long naked body shot out like a shaft into the silver stream where the girl was battling. That was a horrible cry that he gave. I can hear it now if I shut my eyes. I'll always hear it. Do you know what I'm talking of? It was the cry of the soul coming back to the body it had left, and I heard it. He reached her in 3 strokes, and he swam toward this side of the shore. I prayed then. I'd not prayed for 10 years, but I prayed quick as he was striking out for this bank. And I knew then that God Almighty had done something in his own way, and that he'd made me a witness of the miracle. She'd fainted when he reached the bank, and I crouched in the shadow and watched them. Very gently, he picked her up in his long, sinewy arms and carried her up to the bungalow, and I walked on air as I followed. I was stunned. I was incapable of doing anything. He carried her in the door and placed her on the couch that was inside. And then she came to her senses and spoke to him. I listened in the dark outside. For a minute, he didn't answer. And then he spoke as if the floodgates of his soul had been suddenly ripped away. And I crawled away down to the Dyak village. It was not for me to hear anymore. I'd heard enough. Yes, I had heard enough to tell me that she was as safe as if she was in her mother's home in Baltimore. That was all I wanted to know. She was one of God Almighty's angels, and Henslow and I were but two pieces of mud alongside her. That's all we were. She was the greatest woman I've ever known. I'm sorry I've taken so much of your time to tell you this story. But I got a letter from them yesterday, and it brought it all back to me. Incidentally, Henslow is lecturing at one of the American universities, and he's making good. He's a great naturalist, as I told you. But that woman, Lord, Henslow was right about the flowers. They wouldn't bud in spring if there were not women like her in this world. That is so.
You have just heard a short story by James Francis Dwyer entitled The Soul Trapper, as told by Nelson Olmsted. The singing voice was performed by June Shielman. Nelson, that was a wonderful story.
Yes, Hugh, it's always been one of my great favorites. Incidentally, the author, Mr. Dwyer, has had a rather sensational life. He was born in Australia and has been all over the world. He's worked at everything, and as a writer has sold over 1,000 short stories in the United States, England, and France, and has published 11 books. At the moment, he's working on his autobiography, which should be one of the greatest adventure stories of our time.
Well, Nelson, I'm anxious to read that.
Yes. Hugh, before we ring the chimes, I want to say one more thing. This story tonight was the 6th and last of a short series of programs with which NBC has allowed me to experiment. All of us who've been concerned with the show, Norman Felton, the producer, Joseph Colicchio and Richard Shores, who created the original music, and Mike Eisenminger, who created the sound, have enjoyed very much the opportunities which this experiment has allowed. In closing, let me thank all of you who've been good enough to write to us, and thank you for listening. This is Nelson Olmsted saying good night and good reading.
Our nation is still suffering from a shortage of the fats and oils so necessary to the manufacture of soaps and other commodities that you need to run your home. Save all your waste kitchen fats and take them to your meat dealer. He will pay you for all that you bring in. Remember, start saving all your waste kitchen fats today so that you can have more of the things you need tomorrow. This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.